is that the livestock sector emerges as one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. The livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, measured in CO2 equivalent. This is a higher share than transportation. So if we took all the trains and planes and cars and all these things combined, they contribute less to global warming than the livestock industry. It's really good that Al Gore is talking about changing light bulbs and driving vehicles that have less emissions or carpooling or so on. But the fact is the most important thing we can do to take a bite out of global warming is not to eat animal foods. A vegan driving a Hummer produces fewer greenhouse gas emissions than a meat eater riding a bicycle. Also from the United Nations report, the findings from this report suggest that the livestock sector should be a major policy focus when dealing with problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Livestock's contribution to environmental problems is on a massive scale, and its potential contribution to their solution is equally large. The impact is so significant that it needs to be addressed with urgency. Now, there are 2 ways that things generally change. One is through policies, enacting laws. And there's an awful lot to do in that area. Laws to prevent some of the worst cruelties to animals. And also, we're starting to work on this, we have a long way to go, but policies that stop subsidizing agribusiness and the cheap food system. One of the reasons that meat, milk, and eggs are as cheap as they are is because every year the USDA gives millions and millions of dollars to produce cheap corn and soybeans, which end up being animal feed. If those products were not subsidized, the price of feed would be much more expensive, and therefore the price of meat, milk, and eggs would be more expensive. So on the policy front, we need to work to end certain cruelties, to end subsidies that favor irresponsible and abusive practices. But we've got a long way to go there on the policy front. The other place where change can happen is with each of us making personal decisions. And there are many things in this world that are out of our control. But one thing that we have a lot of control over is what we decide to eat every day. And although it's going to take a long time to change laws, we can decide fairly quickly to change how we eat. And I encourage folks here who have not done so already to consider a vegan lifestyle, which involves eating plants instead of animals. Our bodies are much better designed to eat plants instead of animals, and we're seeing the problems associated with animal agriculture in a huge way now. If you look at the number 1 and number 2 causes of death in the U.S. are heart disease and cancer, and the risks of both can be seriously lessened by eating plants instead of animals. Another cost on the environmental side has to do with fossil fuels. This is from a New York Times article from 2008, and the author compared the amount of fossil fuels needed to produce a vegetarian meal versus to produce a meat meal. And what he found was that it took 16 times more fossil fuels to produce a meat meal. So again, it's been recognized in this country that we have sort of an addiction to oil. But it's not been clearly recognized that that addiction to oil is driven in no small part by our addiction to animal foods. Now, all of these problems are unfortunately exacerbated by the USDA and agribusiness's push for farms to get big or get out of business. And a lot of small farms have been pushed out of business, taken over by these industrialized operations that use more fossil fuels, that pollute the water with less concern, that exploit labor. And we've got serious problems with the direction things are going, not only for animals and not only for consumers, but for small farmers. And the attitude that comes with these large farms is equally troubling. There's a commodification of sentient life that is the underlying problem, where the animals are seen as pieces of meat from the day they're born until the day they're killed. The workers are seen as units of production as well. The land is seen as something to extract value from, not soil to invest in. And consumers are seen just as markets, and also mistreated or disrespected. in that we are sold foods and told that foods are healthy when in fact they aren't. And certain myths become considered to be commonly accepted. For example, the dairy industry often wants us to believe that drinking cow's milk prevents osteoporosis. I was at a dairy industry conference a couple of years ago talking with producers, and at that conference they said over and over, people need to drink more cow's milk to prevent osteoporosis. And at a certain point, I grabbed the microphone and said, you guys got to be a little bit careful about what you're saying. If you look at our population in the United States, we drink a lot of cow's milk, and we also have a lot of osteoporosis. So drinking cow's milk clearly does not prevent osteoporosis. And that's a fact. So we are, as consumers, often told things that are not true, and then we act on those things. It's important to get the facts, to look at the empirical evidence, and then to make choices that make sense. And it doesn't make sense, frankly, to be eating foods that make us sick, to be eating foods that contribute to heart disease, cancer, obesity, among other problems. In the 1970s, the McGovern Commission, George McGovern was a U.S. senator, and he put together a panel of experts to advise citizens about how to eat well. And the report they came out with recommended that U.S. citizens eat less meat. Now that report was in print for about a day before it had to be changed. Agribusiness is very influential in Washington, D.C., as well as in various state capitals across the country. Their report was changed from eat less meat to eat meats that are lower in saturated fat. So it was completely reframed from eat less to eat more with a qualification. And unfortunately, the message most people got was to continue eating animal products and to eat more animal products. And we are now seeing the unfortunate results of that. The current generation of children, for example, is expected to have a shorter life expectancy than their parents, and that's the first time that's happened in U.S. history. So we have serious consequences that are caused by this unhealthy food, this irresponsible system. And one of the attitudinal problems has to do with how animals are looked at. This is a picture from Lancaster Stockyards, where we started back in 1986 documenting what happens on farms, stockyards, and slaughterhouses. And when I and other animal people would go into these places, we would look at the animals and we would look at their faces and we would recognize their fear. We would see their expressions. We had a sort of empathy towards the animals. The stockyard workers and the people doing business there would often just look at the body of the animal and literally see cuts of meat, not looking at the animal's face, not recognizing them as an individual, but instead seeing them literally as cuts of meat. So that's one big attitudinal difference. And as farms have gotten bigger and more industrialized, there's been more of a commodification of sentient life, the animals, but also I would argue that callous disregard for other animals then leads to a disregard for humans, disregard for the environment. Going to Lancaster Stockyards, we often found dead animals, and this is a picture of part of the dead pile behind Lancaster Stockyards. You see dead sheep there, you see a dead cow there. In the foreground is a skeletal remains of a calf. As we approached this pile, the maggots were so thick you could hear them buzzing. But out of this pile, the sheep at the far right lifted her head. She was still alive. So we were stunned that a living animal could be thrown here. Rushed around to find a veterinarian, and we finally did. Took her to the veterinarian thinking she'd have to be euthanized. But then as he started examining her and poking around and looking at her, she stood up. And that's Zilda. She survived from Lancaster Stockyard and lived with us for more than 10 years. So we started a campaign at Lancaster Stockyard, and we argued that animals that are too sick to walk, they're called downed animals, should not be allowed to be sold. They should not be going into the human food supply. They should either be given proper veterinary care to be made healthy, or they should be humanely euthanized. They should not be left to suffer. They should certainly not be thrown on dead piles. But at the time, and this was in the mid-1980s, Lancaster Stockyards was seen as a pillar of the community in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was getting ready to celebrate its 100-year anniversary. And meanwhile, we were these vegetarian activists that lived in a school bus on a tofu farm.